Okay, so in this session I want to build on what I talked about last time, which is that notion of what are some of the underpinnings of how the Institute for Human Security and Social Change thinks about how change happens, and then what that means for how we start to work and how we start to engage in processes of social change, particularly as outsiders trying to work with people in other countries or in other parts of our own country. So one of the frameworks that is useful in terms of then thinking about how we engage and the context we're engaging in is this framework that we've borrowed from David Snowden. So it's worth going to his YouTube video and actually understanding this a bit further, but very simply it talks about there being different contexts we might work within, from contexts which are quite simple, where we know and understand exactly what's going on here and what's the cause and effect, and we know what to do. And when you think about those sort of situations in an aid and development world, it might be when we're administering vaccines. So we know that if children are jabbed with this sort of vaccine, this disease will be prevented. We know how to transport and refrigerate and apply the vaccine in a safe way. It's a simple cause and effect relationship, and we can control that situation. A lot of the places we work in, though, are more complicated than that, and in those sort of situations there are many more steps in the process. We can still work out, we can still apply past experience and say we know what needs to be done here, but it's basically there are many more things that could go wrong and many more variables to control. So one example you might think about is where we're looking at setting up a water supply in a refugee camp. We know all the things that that need to be done, but there are variables like the local leadership and what they think, the different ethnic groups that might need to have different access, the role of women and how they need to be protected, the amount of water that's available. There's both technical and social, if you like, and small p political aspects that need to be thought about. But then, like I was saying in the previous video, a lot of the work that we do is often in very complex contexts, and in those situations we can't understand the cause and effect. It doesn't just simply go in one direction. It's influenced by so many different factors and could be changing as we're trying to engage in it, that it's just not possible to say this is what we're going to do based on what we've done before. So in those more complex arrangements, what we have is the need to experiment, if you like. Use our best knowledge and our best practice, use what we know is good principled practice, and then take steps, experiment and understand. And of course there are some situations where the environment is completely chaotic, and you could think in a war situation or in a tsunami or a disaster situation, certainly in the midst of that, perhaps not immediately afterwards when you're in a relief stage, but in the midst of that situation, it's about just acting and protecting and applying principles and seeking to try and get to some stability. Now, most situations we work in have something of all of those present most of the time. So some bits of aid and development work operate in complex contexts, but there are simple things and simple bits that need to be done and complicated bits that need to be acted on, as well as understanding the complexity of that context, and at times they could be chaotic as well. So it's a very artificial framework, but it gives you a bit of a way of starting to make sense of, well, what am I trying to do and where does it fit, and does this actually match the context within which I'm working? The other thing to just be aware of that is important in thinking about aid and development practice these days is the challenges that have now emerged to that more traditional practice. So you remember that I talked about some of that more traditional aid and development work, which has been about people in richer countries with more resources defining a problem in another location, perhaps with a bit of participation and consultation, but largely defining a problem as the absence of, and then taking resources from a rich situation and putting it into that other location in order to solve the problem, and understand that as a closed and simple problem that once solved then doesn't need to be readdressed. So a number of areas of work have started to emerge to challenge that, largely because it hasn't been working. And so you've got three different but very overlapping schools of thought that have developed. So the Doing Development Differently group, who've largely come out of some of the World Bank work. Basically, they've been talking about working much more at local levels and finding local solutions. So instead of thinking that this is all about coming in with a blanket solution that fits in all locations, the Doing Development Differently group have very much been about building solutions that are appropriate for that local context, working with local people and their understanding of that context. In a similar way, the Thinking and Working Politically group, who've emerged really out of the Developmental Leadership Program, which is a program that's partly run out of here at La Trobe, have been very concerned to think about what they call a developmental leadership, which is the need to work with local partners, local coalitions, local agents and actors to really think about, okay, what are the politics, small p politics working here? What's actually driving people, both ideologically, culturally, socially, but also in terms of their own immediate gain or not, to make these decisions and to be entrenched in these particular situations. How do we engage with that? How do we work in the grain of that and work in ways that take people into the opportunity for new solutions? Not that we'll come up with those solutions, but unleash the potential for people to do that. And then problem-driven iterative adaptation, which again has really come out of the Harvard work and a bit of the World Bank work, has been much more about, okay, let's focus on learning as we go. Let's not assume we know what the answers are. Let's try and look at where there have been solutions and learn from those, so a positive deviance approach. But then let's try things, learn, adapt, take a very flexible approach to problem solving and to change. And then scale that not through copying that and doing it other places, but scale through what's known as diffusion, which means scaling it through other people seeing what we're doing and then adapting it to their situation. So these three areas are now these three approaches are now widely talked about, and they share a number of similar and common features, if you like. They basically want to see and understand and engage with the world as it is, not how we want to frame it, not how we would like to put it in a particular box with particular boundaries so that we can make sense of it or reduce it to a simple or complicated context. They're basically all arguing from different perspectives that you have to take the world and the people and the context and the problems as they are. And that's messy and particularly non-linear. That doesn't go in a simple direction. Development is not something where you start at one thing and it goes to another. Change is messy and it goes in all different directions. They all also agree that there's no predetermined solutions, and this is really important because traditional aid and development is almost predicated upon this whole project cycle notion where you come up with what you're going to do and the solution to the problem, and you design for it and you get funding for it and you implement it and then you measure what you've done at the other end. But if you accept there is no predetermined solutions and you have to work it out as you go along with local actors and within the appropriate to the context, that raises a whole range of issues that challenge a lot of the frameworks and approaches and structures and systems that traditional aid and development is predicated on or is built on. That's a real problem, and we'll talk a bit about that a bit later. But the other thing that all these three new approaches really assume is that you have to work with other people. You can't possibly work all of this out for yourself, particularly not sitting in your office in Australia or even sitting in your office in that country. There will need to be many people involved, and working with others is key to solutions. What that leads us to is a whole new set of tools and approaches. So traditionally, aid and development used what's known as a problem analysis to making sense of the world. And that basically assumes that if you have enough time, information, if you do enough good analysis, you can work out what are the root causes of the problem, You can understand the issues that you have to address, and then you can set in place appropriate measures to address those. And good problem analysis is meant to really try and get to the root causes rather than just simply the observable problems. Now, when we're working in a simple context, or where we're trying to solve a simple problem even in a more complex context, a problem analysis has a lot of merit. But of course, once we start to work and realise that some of those problems are much more complex, then problem analysis, this assumption that you can finally work it all out, just falls apart. And this is really important because a lot of traditional funding mechanisms and design mechanisms will still make the assumption that you're using a problem analysis. You can explain the problem to them, and therefore they'll fund you to solve that problem. So that's really a big challenge. Some of the other analysis tools that start to become more useful when we're working from these other approaches are things like strength-based analysis. Let's work out what are the existing strengths. Let's work out the existing strengths and positive or the attributes already in the situation that could be used to try and solve problems, and let's work with those. Another tool that's been used quite a lot, and one that we've really explored quite a lot at the Institute, is this notion of positive deviance. Let's look at the people who, despite the lack of food in this area, are still feeding their children. Let's look at the people who, despite the high malaria rate, are protecting their children. Let's look at the families where there isn't violence. Let's understand those deviants from a positive perspective and understand what happened there. And then let's think about what does that tell us about what change and what aspects of change might be necessary to make that possible for a wider group. So some of those ideas are really quite powerful, and they start you thinking in different ways. Another analysis tool, which I just wanted to spend a little bit more time with, which I think is really important, is political and social analysis. So if you go back and you make the assumption that change is driven by political, social interactions, both cultural, power-based, values-based, driven by different needs and aspirations of people, then analysing and starting to make some sense of that won't necessarily enable you to map and understand every element and every connection, but it will start you perhaps in the right place and maybe working with the right people or the right areas where change might be. So there's many different forms of political and social analysis out there. The Developmental Leadership Program have some excellent materials around this, but they also ask these sort of questions. You know, what are the formal and informal institutions, and by institutions I don't mean organisations, I mean the ways people are, come together and decide how things happen, and the laws and the values that shape the current issue. You know, if we're talking about violence against women and children in a country, where did these ideas and these norms come from, and who controls them? Which groups have actually challenged them? And when we've had some reforms, what worked, what didn't, who supported them? And then to really think about the actors or the stakeholders, both those who benefit and those who might be interested in change. So it gets you to ask questions that engage in that ongoing change process, not to suggest that it's going to tell you everything or give you the problem analysis, but it starts you thinking about the problem in a more complex way and potentially helps you to think about where to start with the situation. And that's what this is about from our perspective. It's about how you engage with change. So the analysis tools are trying to understand what is driving change in every given context, and then what we can do about it. Now, this brings me finally to a really important concept that you'll hear a lot of, particularly in aid and development work these days, which this is notion of theory of change. And as you'll see from the literature, this notion, theory of change, is talked about in many different ways. It's used in many different forms. Mostly these days, it's used to mean program logic, or the strategy that we're using in this program to solve that problem or to address this issue or to engage in this way. But I prefer to use it in its original form, the way that it was originally thought of. And that is to really summarise what we know about how change happens in this situation. So it's a theory. We've done our analysis, we've talked to lots of people, we've spent time trying to understand the situation. It's complex, we can't map it all, but we have a bit of a theory about some of the things that influence change here. And they might be culture, they might be peer, they might be identity issues, they might be values, they might be laws, they might be political opportunity for particular leaders, there might be a combination of things. Now, we can't possibly engage in all of those things, but understanding what seems to drive change or limit change in a particular situation gives you a starting point then for thinking about, so what could we do about it? And that's where we talk about a theory of action or a strategy. So what could be our strategy in this situation, given what we know and what we think is what is important about change? And this is a really important starting point when you want to both utilise one of those three approaches to making change happen that I talked about, but also once you acknowledge that change is a complex, wicked, interdependent, global issue driven by power, culture, values, ideas, then you start to realise you can't contain it into a simple problem box and make a nice little strategy and have a design that's going to solve that problem. There's going to be so many more things happening. So a better approach is to think about, well, what do we know about change? What's our theory? What could we do about it as an outsider trying to work with people in that situation? So it causes you to reimagine and redesign the project cycle. So instead of a typical project cycle where we have analysis, concept, design, implementation, we start to say, okay, we're going to use our analysis tools to start us thinking about how change might happen in this context. What might be the drivers and the influences of change? What might be the opportunities to create more change? And then our strategy, our theory of action, our approach or our implementation is about, well, where would we start? And what could we do? Who could we work with? What could be the opportunities to engage in this change situation in a way that could influence it towards more positive change? And then how do we write that down in a document or in words or in different summaries or communicate it so others can understand it and then take it up and implement it? So design becomes less of a document and more about a communication process to summarise some of that information and thinking and create the space so that people can then start to work in the ways that your analysis shows might be the ways to start to influence towards positive change.